Now transition to a very special highlight for tonight, our presentation of the Big Pie Award. Before we present it, let me tell you a little bit more about that. Since 1950, the Big Pie Award has been presented to alumni brothers who are held in high esteem by virtue of their outstanding accomplishment, which brings honor to Pi Lambda Phi Fraternity. It is essentially our Lifetime Achievement Award. And the Big Pi chapter has become a who's who of well-regarded and famous Pi Lambs. Previous honorees include Olympians and professional athletes, Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winners, civil servants, and distinguished military flag officers, titans of the business world, esteemed educators, notable entertainers, and very generous philanthropists. Some of the names that you might recognize: Sandy Koufax, Rayford Johnson, Bud Selig, Richard Rogers, and Oscar Hammerstein, both Pi Lambs. Lee Steinberg, Governor Ed Rendell, Senator Ben Cardin, and many more. Tonight, we honor the newest member of our Big Pi chapter, Brother and General Keith Dayton. To formally introduce this year's recipient, I'm now going to call on another Big Pi inductee from 2011, Brother Rear Admiral J. Timothy Riker.
Good evening. I'm a lawyer, and every time I come and stand behind one of these podiums, I'm tempted to start off by saying, "May it please the court and good morning, Your Honor." And I one time, in uniform, started a military briefing in front of a Navy admiral just that way. So you can imagine the reaction that I got. Before I proceed into my introduction of Lieutenant General Dayton, I do want to take an opportunity to recognize Ian Lowe and Calvin Carey for their outstanding work in putting together this convention. Really remarkable. Thank you. I am immensely grateful and personally humbled somewhat to have been asked to introduce Lieutenant General Dayton. A very remarkable individual with a very remarkable career. And an American soldier who happens to be a brother and this year's recipient of the Big Pie Award. I will turn my introduction into two parts. One, some observations about General Dayton's career that I think, particularly among the younger brothers, you may appreciate hearing, certainly in later years. And secondly, I will also turn to what I consider to be the confluence, a nautical term, which I'll explain later, the confluence between the creed and an oath that General Dayton spoke and recited when he entered service. General Dayton, of course, is retired from the United States Army. A couple of comments about the United States Army. In my view, the United States Army seldom gets the full credit it deserves for the services it performs. It may be of interest to note that the United States Army is older than the United States. Think about it. The United States Army was created on June the 14th. We now celebrate that as Flag Day, 1775. That was before we declared independence from Great Britain. The United States Army predates the United States of America. Second, from a nautical perspective, you may be interested in knowing that the United States Army, at least at one time, had more floating bottoms. Not all things that float are ships or boats or cutters or yachts. We refer to them in the sea services as bottoms. At one time, the United States Army had more bottoms than the United States Navy. Finally, I will mention to you that a couple of the best sailors that I've ever served with were soldiers. They were pilots in service to the Army Transportation Command, and they could bring ships into port with precision. That's the focus that can come with the United States Army. And I enjoyed serving with the Army on several occasions, overseas during Desert Storm, the Army Transportation Command, and more recently in Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti, where I served alongside of the 10th Mountain Division, which at that time was commanded by Colonel James Dubik, who also went on to become and retire as a lieutenant general. And we had a very easy relationship when it came to jurisdiction. Who was responsible for what and who was responsible not for what. It was a handshake deal, and Jim Dubik and I agreed if it's wet, it was my responsibility. If it was dry, it was his responsibility. It worked out very, very well. Well, let's talk about Lieutenant General Keith Dayton, and let's go back to 1970. 1970, young Mr. Dayton, having been reared in Northern Virginia, having graduated from Mount Vernon High School, having applied for and been accepted for an ROTC scholarship at the College of William and Mary, was preparing in that spring of 70 to trade mortarboard and academic gown for the cover and uniform of the United States Army. He had an obligation to fulfill. It was a debt that was fairly owed. ROTC scholarship, obtain the degree, but then the expectation, the standard was there's an obligation to country for a period of time. So he entered service as a second lieutenant. And judging where I think he probably was in the promotional chain, perhaps the end of his obligation, he had advanced to a first lieutenant. But then he stayed as a captain, and he stayed as a major, and he stayed as a lieutenant colonel, and a colonel, and a brigadier general, and a major general, and finally as a lieutenant general. He stayed the course, and that is something that is honorable to him as an individual, and the constancy of his commitment of service to his nation. There are a couple of aspects about Lieutenant General Dayton's career that I want to emphasize with a couple of brief comments. First of all, you note in his bio that he became a foreign language specialist, Russian of all languages. I always admire individuals who can speak a second language, but to learn the Cyrillic alphabet and to learn the language well enough and become immersed enough into that society and culture and understanding it to become the U.S. Defense Attaché for the United States Embassy in Moscow is a remarkable achievement. One thing the Army does very well, I believe, is identify aptitude. And it was fairly clear, I would say, in young Officer Dayton's career that he had an aptitude for language. But aptitude alone does not cut it. What he demonstrated was something else in addition to aptitude. And that something else was focus and discipline. Aptitude without focus and discipline means nothing. or at least very little. But because young officer Dayton recognized that he had the aptitude, and he applied the focus and the discipline, he assumed a very significant role in the conduct of diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States. That is very noteworthy. Second, let's talk about the Iraq Study Group. I think we can all agree that presidents are seldom given decisions to make with palatable options. Presidents typically receive a number of options, none of which are clear-cut. Mr. President and the senior leadership of the United States government, if we do this, here's the risk. Here's the possibility. Here's what could happen wrong. Lieutenant General Dayton, as a general officer, not lieutenant general at the time, conducted the Iraq Study Group and came back to the President of the United States with truth. The mission was to find what is the truth. And I believe that the evidence shows, and I think that Lieutenant General Dayton did discuss this this morning, that the news that the President was given was not the best. But presidents rely on thoroughness and honesty. And when it comes to delegating responsibility, the president and the senior military leadership of the country need to rely upon the thoroughness and the absolute honesty of the person who's charged with that particular mission and finding the truth. So I offer those two aspects of General Dayton's career in addition to the number of distinguished roles that he's played. Now, to conclude, let me talk a little bit about what I talked about, the confluence. I said it's a nautical term. It's usually applied to rivers. The Allegheny, Monongahela, the confluence form the Ohio River. There is a confluence between the Ohio River and the Tennessee, between the Ohio and the Cumberland, between the Ohio and the Mississippi, so on and so forth. And actually, I've been at the confluence and have stood right at the point of the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River. I did that one time, and I wanted to put 1 foot in the Ohio River and 1 foot in the Mississippi River. It was a great experience, very muddy, but it was a great experience. But there's a confluence between creed and the oath that Lieutenant General Dayton took when he became an officer. Let's talk and review again the creed. We spoke it earlier tonight. You can hear it again. It needs to be spoken as much as possible. That all men are created free and equal. No exceptions. All men are created free and equal. That no society of men can flourish unless the members of that society are given the notion, the opportunities, and the privileges of freedom. That freedom implies the elimination of prejudice. That the elimination of prejudice means a better understanding twixt men. That it is incumbent upon me to fight for such freedom, even with my life. That it is incumbent upon me in my personal life to devote myself to the highest standards of honesty and justice. And that because my country is dedicated to the highest principles of freedom and justice for all men of all creeds, I pledge allegiance to my country and to its national symbol. Keith Dayton brought that into the United States Army with him. Now, truth be told, I'm absolutely certain that those basic principles were inculcated in Keith Walter Dayton as a boy, as a youth, as a teen. But it was in Pi Lam that, if nothing else, they were reinforced and put down in a formal manner. That's what the Pi Lambda Phi creed came with Lieutenant General Dayton when he first entered service. But he also took another oath. It's the oath of all commissioned officers. I do solemnly swear that I will protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. That I take this obligation freely, without any reservation or purpose of evasion. And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I'm about to enter, so help me God. That's the confluence. Creed is a set of beliefs, and the oath was a promise. And that's what Keith Walter Dayton has demonstrated in a career of achievement. And I conclude by pointing out, lest there ever be any doubt, one says, well, all right, what does this country dedicate itself to? Well, Keith Dayton swore an oath to the Constitution, right? Preamble of the Constitution. We are the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. That's what Keith Walter Dayton pledged to do. And that, members, brothers, is what he has demonstrated through a lifetime of achievement. 52 years ago. So you younger ones, think ahead, because you will be doing the policy decisions in whatever field you choose, sometime starting in the mid-20s, into the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s. Keith Walter Dayton and I won't be here, but you remember the heritage that you have inherited from individuals like him. Gentlemen and your guests, please rise and recognize Lieutenant General Keith Walter Dayton, United States Army, retired, Big Pi recipient.
First, I'm going to pin the Big Pi medal on you. Hopefully. Sometimes these things are tricky. Success. I'm going to hand you the Big Pi plaque for a photo. I'm also going to join as well.
I learned early on, and please sit down, in the Army from an old colonel. He said, whenever you get up in front of a group of people, remember three things. Be brief, be brilliant, and be gone, okay? Tim, I have been introduced in many fora, in many occasions, and I have never heard an introduction like that. That was absolutely stupendous. Not quite sure what to say. I accept this, Ian and fraternity brothers, basically on behalf of my fraternity brothers over in that corner. As you get older, you get more emotional, by the way. But, you know, these people have been part of my life for 52 years, as you heard, and actually 3 years before that. The confluence that Admiral Riker spoke of between the creed and the oath of office of any commissioned officer in the United States military is true. It's remarkable that in the 19th century, 3 guys in New York came up with a creed that reflects the essence of the United States and still does almost 200 years later. That is really quite an amazing thing. And I think all of you, if you haven't memorized it, as the Admiral obviously has, you need to do that, because memory is a great thing, and it can lead you to conclusions that you didn't even know you knew. The oath of office, as he said, we swear an oath to the Constitution, not to the President, but to the Constitution of the United States. I think it's the same in the Coast Guard. Enlisted people swear actually to the President, but we are promoted by the Congress of the United States based on the Constitution. You heard me talk a lot this morning, and so I'm not going to talk much more, but I do want to just remind you all. The quote that seemed to resonate with most of you the best was the one that George Marshall used, which was, if it goes well, they did it. If it goes all right, we did it. And if it goes badly, I did it. I talked about leadership, and that is the essence of leadership. One of your members here very astutely said that means you've got somebody, your subordinates back. That's exactly right. That's what leadership is all about, is taking and protecting the people that work with you and work for you. Now, you're in a fraternity. You're in a national fraternity whose antecedents go back into the 19th century. Think about that for a minute. Not everybody can say that. And you're also in a fraternity at a time when some fraternities have not done well, and they've caused the Greek system to be under question. So it's more incumbent upon you than ever that you live your lives with integrity, with honesty, and with the true sense of leadership. It's incumbent upon you more than ever that you live up to the standards and the values that you just heard Admiral Riker tell you once again to remind you of all of this. And at the end of the day, remember one last thing, and that is that a fraternity is only as good as its member. Fraternities are people. You who are here today represent those people. And you who are here today in some small way are responsible for the welfare of those people. Do keep that in mind, because every one of them who's not here that you represent has aspirations, they have their own challenges, they have their own hopes, and they are deserving of your trust and your confidence and your integrity in your dealing with them. So I'm gonna, that wasn't too brief and it wasn't too brilliant, but I will be gone. But I do want to thank you all very much, and again, I accept this on behalf of my fraternity brothers. I can only hope that 52 years from now, one of you might be standing up here, looking out across an audience of young people like this, and saying to yourself, life is good, and we are in good hands. Thank you very much.